Imagine the Bay of Naples at the end of a long, warm day, when the sea becomes darker than the sky, when the hills seem to soften into blue shadows, when the vineyards on the slopes hold the last gold of evening, and when a traveler approaching from the water might see a lively town resting beneath a quiet mountain. This was Pompeii, not yet a warning, not yet a ruin, not yet a name whispered through museums and books, but a real city of doors and lamps, of bread and wine, of servants and shopkeepers, of painted dining rooms and noisy crossings, of children sent for water, of magistrates seeking votes, of animals pulling carts over hard stones, of old women pausing at shrines, of sailors asking directions, of merchants weighing goods, of families planning tomorrow, and above it all stood Vesuvius, broad and familiar, covered in green in places,
generous to the farms below, beautiful enough to be trusted.
Pompeii rose because people believed this landscape could feed them, protect them, enrich them, and connect them to the wider world. Pompeii fell because the same landscape held a power no war, prayer, coin, office, or painted room could command, and Pompeii was rediscovered because time, which had once closed over the city like a heavy blanket, slowly opened again and allowed later generations to walk where the ancient living had walked, gently, carefully, and with the strange feeling that the past had not vanished, but had been waiting under ash with its breath held. To understand Pompeii as a sleep documentary, we should begin not with terror, but with the slow making of a place. The city stood in Campania, a region where sea routes, river paths, fertile land, and mountain roads met in useful ways. The Sarno plain opened inland connections, the bay welcomed ships, and the volcanic soil produced vineyards, orchards, and crops with a richness that made danger look like blessing long before Rome took firm control. Different peoples and influences shaped the settlement, Oscan-speaking communities, Greek traders and colonists from the wider coastal world, Etruscan power moving across Italy, Samnite strength from the hills, and eventually Roman law, language, and administration. Pompeii absorbed these layers rather than replacing one completely with another. A town can be like a wall covered by many coats of paint, old colors hidden but never entirely gone. And in Pompeii, names, building styles, religious habits, artistic tastes, trade goods, and spoken languages all carried the memory of contact. This made the city neither remote nor simple. It was a place of mixture, where a merchant might handle goods from far away, where a household might honor old protective spirits while also displaying fashionable Roman taste, where local pride lived beside imperial belonging. The rise of Pompeii was therefore not a sudden burst of glory. It was the patient growth of a town that understood location, agriculture, business, defense, and adaptation, the walls that once guarded it, the gates that controlled movement, the streets that gathered traffic, and the forum that framed civic life were all signs of a community learning to turn geography into identity. By the 1st century before Christ, Pompeii had already lived through political pressure, regional conflict, and the expanding reach of Rome. During the Social War, when Rome's Italian allies fought for citizenship and recognition, Pompeii stood on the wrong side of Roman power and was eventually brought under tighter control. After the conflict, Roman veterans were settled there. Latin became stronger in public use, and the city was reorganized as a Roman colony. Yet even this change did not erase everything that had come before. It changed offices, inscriptions, names, landholding, legal identity, and public ambition. But beneath the Roman surface, older habits still moved in family traditions, neighborhood patterns, religious memory, and local speech. This is one of Pompeii's quiet lessons. Conquest does not always make a place new overnight. People still wake in familiar rooms, still know which fountain is nearest,
Still owe money, still love their gardens.
still complain about repairs, still bury their dead, still teach children the paths between home and market, still recognize the smell of rain on local stone. Roman Pompeii became more closely tied to imperial systems of status and law, but it remained a local town with its own rivalries, tastes and rhythms, And because the city was not the capital, because it was neither too grand nor too small, it preserved the middle scale of Roman life in an unusually moving way. It was important enough to be complex, ordinary enough to be intimate, and when it was buried, that middle scale became one of the greatest gifts archaeology would ever receive. A visitor entering Pompeii in its mature years would not first see a silent archaeological park, but movement, walls, smells and sound. The gates opened onto paved streets made from dark volcanic stone, hard under the sandals and wheels of thousands of days. Carts had carved grooves into the roadways. Raised sidewalks kept pedestrians above dirty water and traffic, and stepping stones crossed the streets like small bridges. Placed high enough for feet and low enough for wheels to pass between them, shops opened straight onto the road, some with counters, jars, shelves, and painted signs, while houses often turned inward, presenting a modest or businesslike face to the street and saving their beauty for those allowed to enter. A doorway might lead into an atrium where rain fell through an opening in the roof into a shallow basin where light touched polished surfaces, where family memory, business and reception mingled. Beyond that might lie painted rooms, small bedrooms, storerooms, kitchens, stairs to upper levels, and in wealthier houses, a peristyle garden where columns framed greenery, water, sculpture and shade. Pompeii was not laid out like a perfect new grid, because its streets carried older history, slopes, repairs, growth and adjustment, but it was legible to those who lived there. Every corner had a use, every fountain a set of familiar faces, every wall a surface for messages, every threshold a meaning, and the city's daily map existed not only in stone, but in the memory of feet. The Forum formed the ceremonial and civic heart of the city, a broad open space surrounded by colonnades, temples, administrative buildings, markets, statues, and places where public life announced itself. Here, Pompeians could feel the presence of Rome without leaving Campania. Imperial images, official inscriptions, honorific monuments, legal business, religious ceremonies, and local political display all gathered under the gaze of citizens, clients, vendors, visitors, and the curious. At one end stood the Temple of Jupiter, with Vesuvius visible beyond, a view later generations would find heavy with meaning. But for the Pompeians it was simply part of their known horizon, the god, the city, the mountain, and the marketplace sharing one open view. The Forum was not only beautiful, it was practical. People came to settle matters, hear news, arrange deals, inspect notices, seek favors, judge reputations, and be seen by others. Roman urban life was deeply social and visibility mattered. A generous benefactor wanted his name remembered. A candidate wanted support. A family wanted honor.
A freedman wanted recognition. An official wanted authority.
And even a passerby could measure the order of the world by looking at the square. The Forum reminds us that Pompeii was not merely domestic and picturesque. It had institutions, ambitions, hierarchy, and public memory. And those things were built into stone so that daily life could pass through them again and again. Politics in Pompeii had a local intimacy that survives vividly on its walls. Election notices painted in red or black asked citizens to support candidates for municipal office, praising men as worthy, honest, suitable, generous, or capable. And these slogans appeared not as distant proclamations, but along streets where neighbors walked, shopped, argued, and laughed. Some endorsements came from groups, trades, or individuals, and behind the polite phrases lay the old human machinery of favors. Friendships, family ties, debts, rivalry, confidence, gossip, and expectation. Local offices mattered because they brought honor, influence, duties, and a chance to shape public works. Festivals, finances, courts, and games. Politics was not a thing sealed inside a palace. It was brushed onto plaster beside doors, visible to anyone who could read or ask someone else to read. Pompeii also preserves casual graffiti that feels far less formal. Names, jokes, insults, boasts, love messages, drawings, price notes, and stray phrases. Some rude, some tender, some proud, some bored. some hardly more than a person saying, "I was here." These marks are among the most intimate remains in the city, because they were made for the moment, not for us. And yet they reach us with startling directness. A scratched wall can seem more alive than a statue, because it carries the quick pressure of a hand, the need to speak, the pleasure of leaving a trace. The working life of Pompeii was dense and varied. Bakeries ground grain with heavy mills of volcanic stone, often turned by donkeys or enslaved workers. Ovens held heat through the day. Loaves were shaped, stamped, baked, sold, carried, and eaten. Fulleries cleaned and finished cloth through labor that was wet. Chemical, strong-smelling, and skillful. Metalworkers repaired tools, carpenters shaped fittings. Potters and vendors handled containers. Tavern keepers served food and drink to people who did not always cook at home. Fish sauce and wine moved through storage jars and amphorae. And small workshops filled the city with the rhythms of making, fixing, buying, and selling. A wealthy visitor might remember Pompeii for its painted rooms, but most residents knew it through work, through the opening of shutters, the carrying of water, the counting of coins, the lifting of sacks, the tending of animals, the cleaning of floors, the lighting of lamps, the guarding of goods, the noise of customers, and the ache of the body at evening. The Roman economy was not gentle, and Pompeii contained enslaved people whose labor supported comfort they could not claim, freed people trying to build new identities after bondage, poor free workers whose freedom did not remove hardship, merchants who rose through cleverness, and elites whose wealth depended on land, rents, trade, inheritance, and obligation. The city's rise rested not only on fine architecture, but on hands. The social world inside Pompeii was layered in ways both visible and hidden. A grand house might contain a wealthy family, relatives, clients, guests, freed dependents, enslaved cooks, servers, cleaners, porters, nurses, tutors, and workers attached to business. Yet architecture often separated dignity from labor. The best decorated rooms displayed taste and status, while small service spaces held smoke, tools, storage, and fatigue. Slavery was woven into Roman life so deeply that it could appear ordinary to those who benefited from it. And Pompeii forces modern viewers to remember that beauty and inequality often shared the same doorway. A dining room with exquisite frescoes might depend on people who stood for hours, carried dishes, washed vessels, and disappeared from the scene when guests admired the art. Freedmen and freed women also played important roles, especially in business and religious life. Some gained wealth, sponsored projects, joined associations, and sought honor in ways that challenged older elite boundaries. Women appear in inscriptions, property records, electoral support, religious roles, and household management, reminding us that Roman gender limits did not make women invisible or inactive. Children belonged to this social fabric too, playing, learning, helping, being trained into status or labor, absorbing the city through touch and repetition. In Pompeii, as in any human city, rank shaped possibility, but within each rank there were emotions, ambitions, disappointments, loyalties, and dreams that rarely survive except as shadows around objects. Pompeian houses were worlds of controlled movement, and the finest of them turned domestic space into a carefully arranged experience. A guest entering might first see the atrium, then glimpse a garden beyond, the view deliberately framed to suggest depth, wealth, and order. Walls were painted to expand rooms beyond their actual size, false columns, distant architecture, mythic scenes, theatre masks, birds, fruit, landscapes, and delicate borders created an atmosphere of cultivated imagination. A small bedroom could become a jewel box of color. A dining room could place reclining guests among gods and heroes. A garden wall could open into painted greenery, where real leaves and imagined leaves seemed to mingle. The House of the Faun, the House of the Vetii, the Villa of the Mysteries, and many other spaces show how decoration worked as language, telling visitors that the owner possessed money, taste, cultural knowledge, and a place in the social order. But houses also changed over time. Rooms were repainted, shops inserted into street fronts, spaces rented, repaired, combined or subdivided. And after the earthquake that struck the region before the eruption, many buildings were under restoration. This makes Pompeii feel less like a finished museum and more like a living city caught mid-sentence. Some rooms complete and splendid, some walls rough, some repairs waiting, some ambitions still wet in plaster. The art of Pompeii is one of the reasons the city entered modern imagination so powerfully, because its walls did not merely survive, they survived with color, and color changes everything. We are used to thinking of antiquity in pale stone, but Pompeii gives back reds, yellows, blacks, blues, greens, flesh tones, shadowed rooms, painted gardens, theatrical fantasies, sacred images, erotic scenes, still lifes and mythological dramas. The city shows that Roman visual life was vivid, playful, learned, sensual, and sometimes humorous. Painters borrowed patterns, adapted models, followed fashions, and worked for patrons of different budgets. So art appears in both grand and modest places, not always with equal skill, but always with social meaning. A myth painted on a wall might show education. A garden scene might cool a room psychologically in summer. A still life of fruit and glass might delight the eye and suggest abundance. A painted doorway might make architecture dream beyond its limits. These images were not waiting in empty galleries. They surrounded meals, sleep, business, flirtation, prayer, and family routine when later excavators uncovered them. Europe rediscovered not only Roman art but Roman color, and the buried walls helped inspire entire decorative fashions. Though early removal and exposure also caused losses that can never be repaired, food in Pompeii brings the ancient city very close to the senses, because eating is one of the oldest bridges between strangers separated by time. The people of Pompeii ate bread, olives, oil, wine, legumes, vegetables, fruit, nuts, cheese, fish, shellfish, pork and other meats when available, sauces, herbs and food shaped by class, season, region and trade. Not every household had a full kitchen, and prepared food from shops or taverns mattered in the daily diet of many urban residents. Counters with large jars set into them have often been associated with the sale of food and drink, and whether we imagine a quick meal, a cup of wine, a bowl of something warm, or a conversation with a vendor, the street economy of food tells us that Pompeii was practical before it was picturesque. Carbonized bread found in ovens, amphorae that once held wine, traces of fruit, fish sauce containers, cooking vessels, and dining rooms all reveal different levels of nourishment and display. A rich banquet could be a performance of status, with guests reclining, courses arriving, and painted walls surrounding the scene, while a laborer might eat quickly in a crowded room or doorway. But both acts belong to the city's history. The smell of baking bread, oil, smoke, wine, fish, herbs, and warm stone may be gone, yet objects hold enough memory for imagination to restore them softly. Water shaped the daily choreography of Pompeii. Public fountains stood at street corners and crossroads.
Aqueduct supply fed baths, houses, fountains.
And some private luxuries, and people came with jars or vessels to collect what they needed. Fountains were not silent utilities, they were social places where servants waited, neighbors exchanged news, children watched, animals drank, and the day gathered around necessity. The baths turned water into a civic experience, with changing rooms, warm rooms, hot rooms, cold plunges, steam, oil, scraping, conversation and rest. Bathing was about cleanliness, but also sociability, health, habit and pleasure. The architecture guided bodies through temperature and mood, from the ordinary dust of the street into spaces of warmth and release. Drains, channels, sidewalks, stepping stones, and street surfaces remind us that ancient urban cleanliness was not modern cleanliness. Animals, waste, rainwater, traffic, and human crowding made the city earthy and sometimes foul. Yet systems existed to manage flow and movement. Water entered, water left, feet crossed. Wheels passed and life continued in the late evening. After baths cooled and fountains still ran in the dark. One can imagine the sound of water as one of Pompeii's gentlest voices, a small, continuous music under the louder business of the day. Religion in Pompeii lived in public temples and private corners alike. The city honored gods through official spaces. Rituals, sacrifices, festivals, household shrines, and daily gestures that kept divine presence woven into ordinary life. Jupiter, Apollo, Venus, Isis, household lares, guardian spirits, ancestors, and local sacred habits all belong to the religious landscape in different ways. The Temple of Isis is especially evocative because it shows how religious influence from Egypt, transformed through Mediterranean and Roman practice, could become part of a Campanian city's spiritual life, attracting worshippers who may have sought renewal, protection, mystery, and belonging in homes and shops. Leraria placed the sacred near cooking, storage, trade, and family routine. Painted serpents, small altars, offerings, and protective figures show that religion was not only grand ceremony, it was close to thresholds, meals, and daily uncertainty. Pompeians lived in a world alert to signs, dreams, omens, rituals, and divine favor. Yet they did not understand Vesuvius as modern science understands a volcano. Tremors might frighten them, but earthquakes were part of regional experience. Springs and wells might change, but explanations could vary. Smoke or strange sounds might be interpreted through religion, weather, or local memory. The mountain was sacred landscape. Fertile landscape, familiar landscape, and that familiarity softened fear. Pleasure and spectacle gave Pompeii another face. The theatres offered performance. Music, drama, mime, gathering, and civic display, while the amphitheatre drew crowds for gladiatorial games and other public events. Stone seating held waves of emotion. Loyalty, excitement, cruelty, admiration, boredom, gossip, and pride, because Roman spectacles were social experiences as much as entertainments. People did not simply watch, they belonged to a crowd, and the crowd could become its own force. Pompeii once became involved in violent disorder with visitors from nearby Nuceria after games, showing how quickly civic identity and entertainment could ignite into conflict. Taverns, inns, gardens, private dinner parties, street performances, religious festivals, and market days all added other kinds of enjoyment. Some elegant, some rough, some intimate, some public. The city's pleasures remind us not to imagine its people as solemn figures arranged for tragedy. They wanted amusement, gossip, beauty, victory, music, laughter, sex, drink, conversation, and relief from duty like every city. Pompeii had respectable pleasures and disreputable ones, official celebrations and hidden meetings, refined rooms and noisy corners, and under the later ash. All of these human appetites were preserved not as moral lessons, but as evidence that ancient life was full-bodied and immediate. 17 years before the eruption, a severe earthquake struck the region, damaging Pompeii and nearby towns. The shock cracked walls, harmed public buildings, disturbed temples, changed houses, and forced years of repairs. For us, the earthquake can seem like an omen, but for those who survived it, it was more likely a catastrophe to recover from than a clear warning of volcanic destruction to come. People rebuilt because rebuilding is what living communities do. They propped walls, ordered materials, repainted rooms, repaired baths, adjusted plans, reopened businesses, moved into usable spaces, delayed some projects and carried on under scaffolds and patched roofs. This is part of what makes Pompeii so poignant. It was not sealed at a moment of perfect completion. It was sealed while still healing. Some houses were splendidly restored, others were unfinished, some public works lagged, some walls showed fresh plaster, and some tools or building materials waited for hands that would never return. A city under repair is a city believing in the future, and Pompeii was full of that belief. The earthquake had wounded confidence but not ended it. The mountain had shaken, but the people had answered with mortar, labor, money, patience, and habit, not knowing that the deeper danger had not been exhausted. The eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79 has often been traditionally dated to the 24th of August, based on ancient letter transmission, though archaeological clues have led many scholars to consider the possibility of a later autumn date. For this calm telling, it is enough to remember that it came during an ordinary season of work and expectation, when people were not gathered for the end of the world, but scattered through the usual tasks of a town. Someone was baking, someone was washing, someone was selling wine, someone was repairing a wall, someone was preparing to travel, someone was counting money, someone was caring for a child, someone was thinking about dinner, someone was angry over a debt, someone was tired from heat, someone was looking forward to a bath. The mountain above them had been quiet long enough to seem trustworthy. But beneath it, magma, gas, and pressure were gathering in a hidden system no Pompeian could read. Volcanic time is not human time. It can sleep through generations and then move in hours. And when the eruption began, the familiar sky changed. A column rose above Vesuvius, dark and pale by turns, spreading high into the air, shaped like a great tree to those who watched from across the bay. And the city below entered a day unlike any it had known. At first, the danger came from above as pumice and ash, small stones falling, then more, then enough to cover roofs, courtyards, streets, gardens, and shoulders. The sound must have been relentless, a dry storm without rain. A knocking on tiles, awnings, helmets, baskets, shutters, and bare ground. People had to decide quickly or slowly, and both could be fatal. Some fled early through gates, roads and open spaces carrying children, coins, jewelry, keys, lamps, food, documents, small household gods, or nothing at all. Some stayed indoors, believing shelter was wiser. Some returned for possessions. Some searched for relatives. Some waited for orders. Some prayed. Some watched in disbelief. Some may have thought the fall would pass like a strange storm. Pumice gathered deeper and deeper, making streets difficult, blocking doors, weighing down roofs until beams cracked and rooms collapsed. Those who sheltered could be crushed, trapped, or forced into movement too late. Those who fled had to fight darkness, falling debris, choking dust, panic, and terrain that no longer behaved like a city. Pompeii's map was being rewritten by the volcano minute by minute. A familiar street became a trench, a doorway became a wall.
A roof became a danger, a home became a prison.
Across the bay, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, observed the eruption with the curiosity of a natural philosopher and the responsibility of an official. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, later described the event in letters that remain central to how the eruption is remembered. The elder Pliny attempted to approach the danger by sea, partly to observe and partly to aid those in distress, but the conditions grew severe.
Ash, darkness, difficult winds, falling material, and fear transformed the coastline. He died at Stabiae,
becoming part of the disaster he had tried to understand. While the younger Pliny survived and described tremors, darkness, panic, and the terrifying impression that nature itself had broken its order, his account does not give us every movement inside Pompeii, but it gives the eruption a human witness outside the buried city, a voice from the edge of catastrophe. In modern volcanic terms, the eruption unfolded in phases, with a high eruptive column, falling pumice and ash, collapse of that column, and devastating pyroclastic surges of hot gas, ash, and volcanic material. But for those within reach, there was no calm terminology, only a world growing dark, heavy, hot, and impossible to understand. The final destruction of Pompeii came not merely from the stones that buried it, but from the surges that later swept through with lethal heat and speed. Many who had survived the long fall of pumice were exhausted, trapped, sheltering, disoriented, or still hoping the worst had passed. Some had reached open places, some remained in rooms, some were near city gates, some were with family or companions, some were alone. The pyroclastic surges did not allow negotiation. They carried death through streets and structures, ending breath quickly and covering bodies in material that would later harden around absence. This is why the last moments of Pompeii can feel both immediate and unreachable. We see positions, objects, rooms, and deposits, but not thoughts. Perhaps someone held a child. Someone reached for a door. Someone covered a face. Someone clutched keys to a house that no longer mattered. Someone lay down from exhaustion. Someone called a name that no one answered. We must be careful not to invent too confidently, yet we may imagine with compassion, because archaeology gives posture but not voice. It gives the outline of suffering but not the inner life. And sleep history should approach that silence gently, not as spectacle but as mourning across time. Pompeii was not the only victim of Vesuvius. Herculaneum, Oplontis, Stabiae, and villas across the region were also destroyed or transformed. But each place met the eruption differently. Herculaneum was buried more by hot surges and flows that preserved wood, upper stories, furniture, and organic materials in remarkable ways, while Pompeii was covered largely by ash and pumice before later surges sealed the disaster. The wider region reminds us that this was not a single city tragedy, it was a landscape catastrophe. Families, estates, farms, roads, ports, shrines, gardens, and coastal settlements were altered in one vast event. Yet Pompeii became the most famous because its excavated streets allowed visitors to move through a city at human scale, not merely to look at objects in cases, but to walk past bakeries, fountains, houses, shops, theatres, temples, and tombs. Many Pompeians escaped, and they deserve a place in the story too, because a buried city can make the dead seem like everyone. But survivors carried loss into other lives. They may have sought relatives, petitioned authorities, returned to salvage, rebuilt elsewhere, remembered streets that no longer existed, and told children about the day the mountain darkened. Their grief was not preserved in plaster, but it was real. After the eruption, imperial concern and local salvage followed. The Emperor Titus is remembered for appointing officials and providing aid after the disaster, and people returned to the buried or half-buried places to recover valuable materials, marble, bronze, tools, or personal property. Holes cut through walls and signs of disturbance show that Pompeii was not sealed in complete, untouched purity from the first moment. Some upper parts of buildings may have remained visible for a time, marking where digging could begin. Later evidence even suggests that parts of the ruined area may have seen limited reoccupation or makeshift use, a humbler post-disaster life among broken remains. Though not a restored city, this is a haunting thought. People living near or over the buried streets, using ruins as shelter, storage, or material, while the old Pompeii below was already becoming memory. In the long run, however, the city disappeared from sight. Soil settled, vegetation returned, fields spread, names shifted, roads changed, and the exact urban shape was lost beneath the surface. Pompeii did not vanish because it was far away. It vanished because time can hide even what lies close. If enough earth, habit, and forgetting gather above it, the centuries of burial are part of Pompeii's story, and they should be imagined not as emptiness but as a long, dark preservation. Rooms without footsteps, walls without sunlight, vessels without hands, ovens without heat, shrines without offerings, streets without wheels, bodies returning to hollows, wood decaying into traces, colors protected from weather until excavation would expose them again. The ash that destroyed also guarded, not perfectly, not kindly, but effectively enough that later ages could recover details usually lost in ancient cities. The lack of air and moisture helped preserve forms and surfaces, though organic materials often vanished, leaving impressions, stains, voids, carbonized remains, or mineral traces. This buried state gave Pompeii its extraordinary power, but it also created a paradox. Once excavated, the city began to suffer from the very exposure that made it visible. Rain, sun, plants, tourists, earlier restoration errors, theft, bombing, earthquakes, and pollution all became threats. In other words, Pompeii survived underground, Then began a second struggle above ground. The rediscovery was not the end of danger, it was the beginning of responsibility. And every generation since has had to decide how much to uncover, how much to conserve, how much to display, and how much to leave sleeping. Before Pompeii was fully recognized, accidental discoveries occurred as workers and engineers cut through the landscape. In the late 16th century, work on an underground water channel encountered ancient walls and inscriptions. But the meaning of the remains was not yet understood as the return of an entire city. The past appeared in fragments, like a voice heard through a closed door. Interesting but incomplete. Only in the 18th century did systematic, royal-sponsored digging begin to bring the Vesuvian towns back into European awareness. Excavations at Herculaneum began first, then Pompeii in the mid-18th century. Under Bourbon rule in the Kingdom of Naples, early exploration was driven by royal prestige, collecting curiosity and the taste for antiquity, rather than by modern archaeological method. Tunnels, shafts and clearances searched for statues, bronzes, inscriptions, mosaics and paintings. Beautiful things were removed, walls were broken, contexts were lost. And yet the discoveries were astonishing enough to change the imagination of Europe. Rooms emerged with colors still bright, streets appeared, household objects seemed almost recently abandoned, and the ancient world, which had long been known through texts and scattered ruins, suddenly became domestic, walkable, and intimate. The early rediscovery of Pompeii coincided with the age of the Grand Tour, when wealthy travelers, artists, scholars, collectors, and aristocrats visited Italy to encounter classical antiquity. Pompeii became a place where visitors could feel they were stepping not just among ruins, but into interrupted life. The effect was profound. Ancient painting influenced modern decoration, architecture, borrowed Pompeian motifs. Writers turned the city into romance and warning. Collectors desired objects from the buried towns, and scholars began to realize that everyday material culture could teach as much as famous texts. But the early period also carried losses. Paintings were cut from walls, objects were separated from their settings. Fragile spaces were exposed without adequate protection, and the desire to possess antiquity sometimes overpowered the need to understand it. This is not only a criticism of the past, it is a reminder that every age sees through its own habits. 18th century excavators value beauty, rarity, and royal display, while modern archaeology values context, stratigraphy, ordinary objects, and preservation. Pompeii's rediscovery therefore tells two stories at once: the thrilling return of a lost city and the slow education of modern people in how to treat the past with less greed and more patience. In the 19th century, Giuseppe Fiorelli transformed the excavation and recording of Pompeii in ways that still shape the site today. He introduced a clearer system of regions, blocks, and doorway numbers, giving the city an organized archaeological address, so that houses, shops, and finds could be described more precisely. He also developed the famous casting method that gave physical form to voids left in the hardened ash by decomposed bodies and other organic materials. Liquid plaster was poured into cavities, and when the surrounding material was removed, the shapes of victims appeared with startling humanity. Folded limbs, covered faces, twisted bodies, clothing impressions, belts, sandals, and postures from the final moments. The casts became among the most powerful images of Pompeii, but they are not simple objects. They are both evidence and memorial, both scientific record and emotional encounter. They have helped visitors understand the disaster not as an abstract eruption, but as human suffering, yet they also ask for dignity, because the people represented did not choose to become displays. Modern studies, including scanning and analysis of remains within casts, have refined older assumptions about age, sex, health, and relationships, reminding us that even the most familiar images of Pompeii can still be misunderstood. As archaeological practice improved, Pompeii became a vast classroom for studying ancient urban life. Scholars learned to read not only statues and inscriptions, but wall repairs, cooking equipment, drains, doorways, graffiti, storage jars, garden beds, animal bones, pollen seeds, floorware, shop counters, stair scars, and the distribution of small objects inside rooms. A bakery could reveal food production, labor, animal power, and neighborhood supply. A fullery could reveal textile work, chemistry, water use, and the smell of industry. A tavern could reveal mobility, sociability, and the needs of people without formal dining rooms. A garden could reveal planting, irrigation, leisure, perfume production, or status. A shrine could show how the sacred lived near everyday work.
Even empty spaces mattered, because absence can mean upper floors lost.
Furniture decayed, doors removed, or rooms cleared before disaster. Modern Pompeii is not only excavated, it is interpreted again and again, each generation asking different questions about women, slavery, children, migration, trade, diet, disease, identity, climate, risk, preservation, tourism, and memory. The city remains fruitful because it was never one thing, it was a living system. And living systems keep offering new answers when examined with new care. One of the tenderest ways to imagine Pompeii is through its gardens, because gardens soften the stone city and show how people arrange nature inside walls. Wealthy houses might include peristyle gardens with columns, fountains, pools, sculpture, flower beds, vines, shade, and painted landscapes that extended the real plants into illusion. Smaller gardens might grow herbs, fruit, ornamentals, or practical plants, and some green spaces were tied to production, scent, dining, or household pleasure. Archaeologists have studied root cavities, pollen, seeds, planting patterns, and water systems to understand what once grew there. And some gardens have been replanted in modern times to evoke ancient arrangements, though always with caution, because restoration is interpretation, not resurrection. Gardens matter because they remind us that Pompeii was not only stone, heat, business, and disaster. It had leaves, fragrance, bees, birds, damp soil, pruned vines, shady afternoons, and the slow satisfaction of tending life. A person reclining near a fountain in a painted garden did not think of being preserved for history. That person thought of conversation, temperature, taste, status, comfort, or private rest. The restored idea of green Pompeii helps us see the city before ash, when walls were not ruins but backgrounds for growth. The tombs outside Pompeii's gates tell another quiet story, because Roman cities placed the dead along roads beyond the walls, where travelers passed monuments, inscriptions, portraits, benches, and family memorials. Death was not hidden from movement. It stood beside the routes of trade and return, reminding the living of name, status, affection, and obligation. Some tombs were grand, some modest, some designed for freed people and their descendants, some built to advertise success achieved in life. Funerary inscriptions preserved relationships,
Offices, generosity, and the wish to be remembered.
The roads outside the gates therefore formed a zone between city and countryside, between commerce and memory. Between arriving and leaving when the eruption came, people fleeing may have passed these tombs, moving by the monuments of earlier deaths while trying to escape their own. After burial and rediscovery, the tomb streets became among the most atmospheric parts of Pompeii, because they show that the city was always surrounded by memory even before it became memory itself. The ancient dead, who had expected descendants to honor them, were buried again by the same eruption that took the living city. And later visitors now read their names under the shadow of Vesuvius. The economy around Pompeii reached beyond its walls into villas, farms, vineyards, workshops, and coastal trade. The city depended on its hinterland, and the countryside depended on urban markets. Wine production was especially important, and amphorae carried local goods outward through regional and Mediterranean networks. Villas near Pompeii could be working estates as well as luxurious retreats, places where agriculture, storage, processing, elite leisure, and enslaved labor intersected. The Villa of the Mysteries, Villa Poppaea at Oplontis, and other nearby sites show the wealth and complexity of the Vesuvian landscape. Not just the town, These villas remind us that Roman luxury was often rooted in land. Production and hierarchy, a painted room opened toward a garden. But somewhere nearby people pressed grapes, repaired tools, managed animals, kept accounts, cooked meals, and served owners or guests. The eruption buried this whole web, not simply an urban center, and the rediscovery of Pompeii became richer as archaeologists connected city houses to suburban villas, rural production, roads, tombs, ports, and regional identities. A city is never only the area inside its walls. It is the visible knot of a much wider fabric, and Pompeii's fabric stretched across fields, slopes, river routes, and sea lanes. The people of Pompeii lived with the Roman Empire in both visible and subtle ways. Emperors appeared in inscriptions, statues, loyalty, calendars, and political language. Imperial peace helped trade. Imperial authority structured citizenship, law, military settlement, taxation, and status. Yet the empire was not experienced only as distant command. It entered kitchens through imported goods, dining rooms through artistic taste, names through citizenship, cult through public worship, and ambition through models of honor. Pompeii's residents could participate in a world far larger than their town, while still caring intensely about local candidates, neighborhood reputation, family tombs, and the nearest fountain. This combination of global and local is part of what makes Pompeii feel surprisingly modern. People lived inside large systems they could not control, but their actual days were shaped by small roots, familiar faces, household obligations, and personal hopes. A merchant might think of shipping an empire in the morning, then worry about a cracked wall by afternoon. A magistrate might honor Rome publicly, then negotiate local rivalry privately. An enslaved worker might handle goods from distant provinces without ever being free to choose a journey. The empire was everywhere, but it was always filtered through the human scale of daily life. When modern visitors think of Pompeii, they often imagine everything frozen at one instant, but the reality is more complex and more interesting. The city preserved a final period, not a perfect single second. Some objects had already been moved because of repairs, some rooms were under construction, some valuables were taken during or after the eruption. Some spaces had been abandoned or repurposed. Some walls were damaged from earlier earthquake activity. Some people had already fled, and later excavation itself changed what remained. Pompeii is a snapshot, but a blurred and layered one, requiring careful reading. This does not make it less powerful, it makes it more human, because real life is always layered. No house is ever fully finished. No city is ever perfectly ready. No family is without unfinished business. When the eruption came, Pompeii contained past damage, current work, future plans, old debts, fresh paint, broken rooms, new wealth, fading traditions, and ordinary mess. Archaeology's task is to sort these layers without flattening them, and the best storytelling should do the same, letting Pompeii be a place in motion before it became still. Conservation today is one of Pompeii's most difficult chapters, because excavation gives access while also creating vulnerability. Walls that slept underground now face rain and wind. Frescoes once protected from sunlight fade when exposed.
Ancient roofs are gone. Drainage must be managed.
Plants root in masonry, crowds wear surfaces, and climate pressures add new uncertainty. The site has also suffered from earlier excavation practices, wartime bombing, earthquakes, theft, and long periods when preservation needs exceeded resources. Modern projects seek to stabilize structures, improve drainage, document remains digitally, restore selected areas, control visitor flow, and decide where new excavation is justified. The question is no longer how quickly can Pompeii be uncovered, but how wisely can it be cared for. Some unexcavated areas may preserve information better by remaining buried until methods improve, and some open areas demand constant attention simply to keep from collapsing. This is a humbling reversal. The ash that once killed protected the city for centuries, while our admiration can unintentionally harm it. To love Pompeii now means not only to visit and marvel, but to accept limits, closures, careful paths, protective roofs, conservation rules, and the patience required to let the past survive the future. Recent archaeology continues to show that Pompeii is not exhausted. New rooms, inscriptions, paintings, construction evidence, household objects, and human remains still appear in carefully targeted excavations. Technologies such as scanning, digital mapping, residue analysis, ancient DNA isotopic study, and advanced imaging reveal information hidden from earlier eyes. Even walls uncovered long ago can produce new discoveries when photographed under different light or studied with better tools. Faint graffiti can reappear, old assumptions about castes can change, and ordinary finds can reshape our understanding of labor, migration, diet, and identity. This ongoing discovery is important because it keeps Pompeii from becoming only a romantic ruin. It remains a research site, a place where knowledge grows through discipline, patience, and sometimes surprise at the same time. Every new discovery enters a world of public fascination, and archaeologists must tell the story responsibly, resisting both dry detachment and sensational drama. Pompeii deserves wonder, but it also deserves accuracy, because its power comes not from exaggeration, but from the honest closeness of what survived. A loaf, a wall note, a child's body, a repaired room, a garden route, a locked door. To walk through Pompeii today is to experience a strange double vision. One eye sees the ruin, the other tries to restore life. The street is empty, but the mind hears wheels, the bakery is cold. But the mind smells bread, the fountain is stone, but the mind sees jars filling. The dining room is roofless, but the mind imagines lamps. Couches, voices, and dishes. The forum is open to tourists, but the mind places statues, officials, petitions, and market noise back into the square. Vesuvius stands in the distance as both landscape and warning, beautiful enough that one understands why it was trusted, terrible enough that one never forgets what it did. The visitor moves between knowledge and imagination, and the most respectful way to do this is slowly, noticing details rather than consuming them. A threshold worn by feet, a groove carved by wheels, a painted bird, a drain hole, a stair base, a political slogan, a small shrine, a repair line in a wall. Each detail asks for time, and when given time, it turns the ancient city from spectacle into companionship. Pompeii also asks us to think about disaster beyond the ancient world, because human beings still build near coastlines. Rivers, faults, volcanoes, forests, and unstable climates. Often because dangerous places are also fertile, beautiful, profitable, or culturally beloved. Risk becomes ordinary when generations survive it. Warnings become background, and people make reasonable decisions inside incomplete knowledge. The Pompeians did not fail because they were foolish. They lived where life had long been possible, just as people have always done, and when nature changed, time for understanding was short. This makes Pompeii not only a story of ancient vulnerability, but a mirror for modern vulnerability. We too trust familiar landscapes. We too repair after disasters and call that recovery. We too turn warning signs into routines. We too depend on systems larger than ourselves. Yet Pompeii should not be reduced to a lesson in fear. It is also a lesson in attention, in the need to read land carefully, to preserve memory, to respect science, to plan for what has not happened in living memory, and to remember that ordinary days are precious because they are never guaranteed. The emotional power of Pompeii comes from the balance between distance and nearness. Nearly 2,000 years separate us from the people who lived there. Their laws, gods, slavery, entertainment, medicine, politics, and household structures differ sharply from ours, and we should not pretend they were simply modern people in tunics. Yet their material traces bring them close. Bread, jewelry, dice, combs, lamps, keys, cradles, tools, wall jokes, garden paths, lunch counters, bath benches, and beds all speak across the distance of bodies and habits. They were not us, but they were human in ways we can recognize. Hungry, proud, tired, amused, afraid, ambitious.
Affectionate, careless, devout.
Practical, vain, generous, cruel, hopeful, and mortal. The city's preservation allows empathy without sameness, and that is one of history's deepest gifts. It lets us meet difference without losing compassion. We do not need to turn Pompeians into ourselves to mourn them,
and we do not need to make them strange to study them.
We can let them remain ancient and still feel the warmth of their vanished evenings. Another way to enter Pompeii is through its gates, because gates are where a city shows both welcome and control. Roads approached from neighboring towns, villas, farms, tomb districts, and the coast, and each gate gathered a different kind of movement. People entered with baskets, animals, building materials, letters, news, debts, invitations, official messages, and tired feet outside the walls. Tombs lined certain roads. Shops and villas extended the life of the city outward, and the boundary between urban and rural was not as sharp as a map can make it seem. A farmer might come in before heat rose too strongly. A traveller might hurry toward lodging before evening. A funeral procession might move out past the walls. A candidate supporter might pause to read or paint a message. A cart might creak under amphorae, and a child might watch all of this as part of an ordinary mourning. The gates remind us that Pompeii was porous. Goods and people passed through constantly, yet walls still mattered as memory and identity. They said that this was a community with a shape, a before and after, an inside and outside. When the eruption came, those gates became routes of escape for some and routes of impossible hope for others. But in the living city, they were simply thresholds between work, travel, trade, and home. The streets themselves were not just empty corridors between buildings. They were social rooms without roofs. Some were broad and important, others narrow and more private. Some carried heavy traffic, others served neighborhoods, and the surfaces show long use. Repairs, drainage choices, and the pressure of wheels. Sidewalks lifted the walker into a safer zone. But they also created spaces where doorways, benches, shop fronts, and wall notices could shape public interaction. Water towers and pipes distributed supply, fountains marked corners, and street shrines or painted symbols added sacred and social meaning to movement. One could read a city by walking it, learning which streets were noisy in the morning, which smelled of baking, which led to the baths, which had the best shade, which houses belonged to important families, which shopkeeper was honest, which doorway to avoid after dark. In this sense, Pompeii's streets were memory machines. Each resident carried an invisible version of the city inside the mind, a map made of habits rather than lines. Archaeology gives us the stones, but imagination must restore the confidence with which people turned corners without thinking, because a familiar street is not experienced as architecture. It is experienced as part of the body among the public buildings. The basilica deserves a quiet moment, not because it resembled a church in the later Christian sense, but because it was a great civic hall for legal and commercial business, with columns, open space, and a sense of official gravity. People came there for matters that could shape fortunes, disputes, contracts, judgments, negotiations, and public dealings. The building stood near the Forum, tying law and commerce to the central life of the city. Its scale would have impressed visitors, reminding them that Pompeii, while not Rome, possessed institutional dignity nearby. Market buildings helped organize the exchange of food and goods, and temples framed the moral and sacred order in which civic business took place. These spaces show that Pompeii was not a random collection of charming houses. It was an organized municipality with buildings that gave form to authority, fairness, trade, worship, and competition. When we imagine sleepily walking through the Forum district after sunset, we can picture these buildings emptied of their daytime urgency, columns cooling in the dark, steps pale in moonlight, and the weight of many spoken decisions lingering in the air like breath after a meeting has ended. The baths of Pompeii deserve to be imagined slowly,
because they gather architecture, engineering, body care,
and social life into one flowing experience. A bather entered from the bright street into a sequence of rooms, leaving behind dust, heat, and business. The changing room held clothes, sandals, perhaps a slave or attendant watching belongings. The warm rooms softened the body. The hot room brought sweat, steam, and conversation. The cold plunge shocked the skin awake, and oils, scrapers, towels, and perfumes completed the ritual according to means, beneath floors and behind walls. Heating systems sent warm air through spaces carefully built for comfort, and the baths became one of the places where Roman urban life felt most communal. Men and women may have used facilities at different times or in separate areas depending on the bath and period, but for all users, bathing linked health, pleasure, status, and routine. People discussed politics, business, gossip, aches, meals, games, and personal news while moving through temperature. It was not a private bathroom in the modern sense. It was a social landscape after the eruption. The bathrooms stood silent, their basins dry, their heat gone, yet the architecture still remembers the sequence of the body: warm, hot, cold, clean, rested. The amphitheatre stands toward the edge of Pompeii like a stone bowl built for collective feeling, and before the eruption, it would have transformed quiet citizens into a roaring audience. People climbed to seats according to status, looked down into the arena, called out, wagered, cheered, complained, admired skill, demanded courage, and carried the emotions of the spectacle back into streets and taverns. Gladiatorial culture can be difficult for modern comfort, because it joins discipline, danger, violence, entertainment, and honor in ways that reveal both the distance and the nearness of Roman life. Pompeians could admire bravery while watching blood, could treat fighters as celebrities while accepting brutality, could turn public death or danger into civic excitement. The famous riot between Pompeians and Nucerians after games shows how a crowd's loyalty could become violent beyond the arena. So the amphitheatre is not only a building of entertainment, it is a building of identity, rivalry, appetite, and mass emotion. When it is empty today, grass and silence soften it, but the shape itself still holds the memory of noise, and in a sleep narration, one may let that noise fade slowly into the hush of abandoned stone. The Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city walls, offers one of the most haunting painted rooms in the Vesuvian world. Its famous fresco cycle shows life-sized figures in a sequence that has been interpreted in many ways, often connected to initiation, ritual Dionysian imagery, marriage, transformation, or sacred experience. The exact meaning remains debated, and perhaps part of its power lies in that uncertainty. Red walls surround figures who seem to move through gesture, emotion, attention, and revelation, creating a room that feels more like a ceremony than decoration. The villa itself was not only an elegant retreat, it was also connected to agricultural production, reminding us again that Roman beauty and work often shared the same estate. Storage, pressing, cultivation, dining, worship, and display could exist close together. When modern viewers stand before the painted figures, they feel the strange intimacy of ancient imagination. Not everything is explained. Not everything should be flattened into one answer. Some images survive as questions, and Pompeii's rediscovery is richer because it includes mysteries that scholarship can approach but not entirely dissolve. Inscriptions and graffiti also preserve the sound of language at different levels. Formal Latin appears in public honors, tombs, dedications, and official notices, while casual wall writing gives glimpses of more ordinary expression. Spelling variation, slang, affection, insult, desire, and humor. These texts matter because most ancient literature was produced by educated elites. While Pompeii's walls preserve a wider range of voices, not everyone who made a mark was poor, and not every graffito is crude. But together they make the city unusually talkative.
Lovers address each other, drinkers boast, friends greet friends.
Candidates receive support, someone mocks someone else, a worker leaves a note, a passerby scratches a name, and the wall becomes a social surface. In a world without phones, posters, and casual digital messages, plaster could receive the passing impulse to speak. What moves us is not only what the words say, but that they were written with no knowledge of us. They belong to the living city's present tense, and yet after burial they became messages in a bottle, sent accidentally across nearly 2,000 years. Children in Pompeii appear through toys, small footprints in imagination, images, household spaces, school references, family tombs, and the simple fact that every city renews itself through the young. They would have lived very different lives according to status, wealth, gender, and freedom. A child of an elite household might learn letters, manners, mythology, family pride, and the expectations of inheritance. A child of a shopkeeper might learn accounts, work habits, and customer life early. An enslaved child might be trained into service with little control over the future. And poor children may have moved constantly between play and labor. Education could happen through formal teaching, household instruction, apprenticeship, imitation, and discipline. One can imagine children at fountains in courtyards near bakeries, watching animals, drawing on walls, running errands,
Falling asleep during adult conversations.
waking to morning work and learning the city not as history, but as the entire known world. Thinking of children changes the story of Pompeii, because it reminds us that the city was not only a place of adult politics and decorated houses, it was a place where futures were being formed, and many of those futures were cut short or displaced by the eruption. Health and medicine in Pompeii belong to a world of practical knowledge, household remedies, professional healers, religious hope, bodily endurance, and social inequality. Surgical instruments found in the city and nearby contexts show that Roman medical practice could be technically sophisticated in certain ways, with tools for cutting, probing, gripping, and treating wounds. But healing depended heavily on status, access, sanitation, diet, luck, and the limits of ancient understanding. People suffered from dental problems, injuries, infections, parasites, childbirth dangers, chronic pain, and the strain of physical labor, baths, diet, exercise, oil, massage, and religious offerings might all be part of caring for the body, while enslaved workers and the poor often had fewer choices and harsher condition. A city is always also a collection of bodies under pressure, bodies that sweat, ache, age, desire, recover, and fail. Pompeii's preserved remains allow modern researchers to study health in ways that written sources rarely permit. Not only the dramatic deaths of the eruption, but the quieter evidence of lives lived inside bones, teeth, posture, and wear. This makes the ancient city more embodied, less like a picture, more like a breathing population. Clothing, grooming, and personal appearance added another layer to Pompeian identity. Tunics, cloaks, sandals, jewelry, hair arrangements, cosmetics, perfumes, and accessories expressed status, gender, occupation, wealth, taste, and occasion. The finest jewelry might signal family wealth or personal pride, while simpler garments spoke of work, practicality, or poverty. Wool, linen, leather, dyes, laundering, mending, and storage all required labor, and the fooleries of Pompeii remind us that clean or finished cloth came from demanding processes. Appearance was never effortless, even in antiquity. A person preparing for a dinner, a ceremony, a business meeting, or a public outing might consider scent, hair, fabric, and ornament, while workers dressed for endurance and mobility. Personal items such as combs, mirrors, pins, perfume containers, and small boxes bring us close to private routines: morning grooming, evening undressing, the adjustment of a cloak before stepping outside, the careful fastening of a brooch, the quiet pleasure of fragrance in a hot climate. Such details may seem small, but small details are where daily life keeps its warmth. The daily rhythm of Pompeii can be imagined from dawn to night. At first light, bakers were already working, fires were managed, animals stirred, water carriers moved, and people opened shutters to the street. Morning brought business, errands, legal matters, market activity, school or instruction, household cleaning, and the constant movement of goods. By midday, heat might slow certain labors.
Meals might be taken. Shade became valuable.
And social calls or business dealings shifted according to status and necessity. Afternoon could bring baths, repairs, accounts, shopping, meetings, or preparation for evening dining. Then lamps appeared, voices changed, streets thinned in some quarters and thickened in others, taverns filled, homes closed inward, and the city's public face gave way to smaller circles of light. This rhythm varied by class and occupation, because a baker, magistrate, enslaved cook, innkeeper, child, laundress, traveller, and wealthy hostess did not share the same day. Yet they shared the same urban atmosphere, the same mountain, the same streets, the same vulnerability and the same final historical fate. To follow one day through Pompeii is to understand that cities are made from overlapping schedules. Not one single story. Night in ancient Pompeii was not absolute silence, but it was different from day. Lamps burned with limited light. Doorways were secured. Some streets grew uncertain. Watchdogs guarded thresholds. Late drinkers moved between taverns.
Lovers sought secrecy, servants finished tasks.
And families settled into rooms that smelled of oil, smoke, bodies, plaster, wood, and stored goods without electric brightness. Darkness had weight and texture. The moon mattered, clouds mattered. The memory of the street mattered, and a person walking late would know the city through sound as much as sight. Distant voices, footsteps, animals, a door bolt, a fountain, a cart if movement was allowed, perhaps music from somewhere still awake. The sleeping city was not dead. It was breathing in layers, some dreaming, some working, some guarding, some ill, some afraid, some content. This is a useful image before sleep, because it restores Pompeii as a place that knew rest, not only catastrophe, a place where thousands of nights passed without disaster, where people trusted that morning would arrive, until one morning came under a sky that changed everything. The rediscovered city has also forced museums and archaeologists to think about where objects belong, because Pompeii's treasures were long removed into collections. Storerooms, royal galleries, and later museums, especially the Great Museum in Naples, where mosaics, frescoes, bronzes, tools, sculptures, and intimate objects could be studied and protected. Removal sometimes saved fragile works from weather, but it also separated them from their architectural settings, creating a tension between preservation and context. A painting in a museum can survive better, but it no longer surrounds the room for which it was made. An object in a case can be seen closely, but it no longer sits on the counter, shelf, or floor that explained its use. Modern display tries to repair this separation through documentation. Replicas, digital reconstruction, careful labels, and sometimes returning selected experiences to the site, but the tension remains. Pompeii teaches that artifacts are not isolated jewels, they are relationships, and a humble pot found in place may explain more about life than a beautiful object without a home. War and modern crisis have touched Pompeii too, especially during the 20th century. When bombing during the Second World War damaged parts of the archaeological area, and later earthquakes and neglect added to conservation struggles, this reminds us that rediscovered heritage does not float outside history. It continues to live within human conflict, funding choices, politics, weather, tourism, scholarship, and public care. A city buried by a volcano can still be harmed by bombs, bureaucracy, theft, rain, and indifference. Yet it can also be helped by cooperation, expertise, international concern, improved conservation, and public love. The modern story of Pompeii is therefore not only about ancient Rome. It is about our responsibility toward inherited places. Every generation receives the site in a condition shaped by earlier choices, some wise, some careless, and then passes it onward either stronger or weaker. This is a sobering thought, but also a hopeful one, because preservation is a form of gratitude, a way of saying that the lives once lived here still matter enough to protect. The question of how to display the dead has become increasingly important, because Pompeii's casts are unforgettable, but unforgettable things can be consumed too quickly. Older displays sometimes emphasize shock, while newer approaches try to combine scientific explanation with respect. The bodies are evidence of volcanic processes, evacuation choices, health, clothing, and death. But they are also human remains or forms made from human absence, and so they should not be treated like theatrical props. When researchers study them with scans, DNA, or skeletal analysis, they may overturn sentimental assumptions, for example, about family relationships or identity, showing how easily viewers invent stories from posture alone. This does not reduce compassion, it deepens it, because real people are more complex than the stories strangers place upon them. Pompeii asks us to mourn without pretending certainty, to study without coldness, to look without taking possession, and to remember that the dead do not exist for our entertainment. They belong first to their own lost lives, then to the careful work of memory. The scientific study of Pompeii's plants and food remains has opened a quieter doorway into the city, one made not of marble or monuments, but of seeds, pollen, root cavities, carbonized fruit, grains, nuts, and traces left in soil. These small remains help scholars reconstruct orchards, vineyards, kitchen gardens, ornamental beds, and the agricultural habits of the region. They show what grew near houses, what was eaten, what was traded, and how nature was arranged for pleasure and usefulness. A fig seed or grape pip may seem humble beside a fresco, but it can be just as eloquent because it restores season, taste, climate, and labor, the pruning of a vine, the storage of walnuts, the crushing of olives, the scent of herbs near a kitchen, the shade of a pergola over a dining couch, the small satisfaction of fruit ripening in a courtyard. These things belong to Pompeii as surely as temples and theatres, and they remind us that ancient history is partly botanical, rooted in the earth that made the city possible and the volcano that finally covered it. Women's lives in Pompeii appear through many scattered signs, not always in the full voices we wish we had, but enough to resist silence. Women owned property, sponsored buildings or restorations, supported candidates, managed households, participated in business, served religious roles, appeared in portraits, inscriptions, tombs, and legal memory, and worked in ways that ranged from elite management to shop labor, service, production, and enslavement. The famous public priestess Eumachia, associated with a large building in the Forum area, shows how a woman could become part of civic visibility through wealth, family, religious office, and public generosity, while less wealthy women appear through humbler traces, names on walls, objects in rooms, workspaces, tombs, and domestic arrangements. No single image can represent them all because status changed everything. A wealthy widow, an enslaved girl, a tavern worker, a merchant's wife, a priestess, a mother, a freedwoman, and a child lived under different pressures, yet all belonged to the city's fabric. And remembering them makes Pompeii less like a male civic stage and more like a complete human settlement. The rediscovery of Pompeii also influenced how later people imagined home itself, not only how they imagined Rome, because the excavated rooms offered models of color, proportion, wall decoration, garden arrangement, furniture placement, and domestic theatricality. European artists, architects, designers, and patrons borrowed Pompeian motifs for salons, villas, museums, ceramics, wallpapers, and stage designs, sometimes carefully, sometimes fancifully. The ancient house became a modern dream, a way to live among classical elegance without living under Roman law. This fashion could be beautiful, but it also transformed a disaster site into style, separating ornament from the lives and deaths that gave it meaning. Still, the influence shows how powerfully Pompeii answered a desire in the modern world, the desire to touch antiquity not only through heroic statues and ruined temples, but through rooms, colors, patterns, and intimate spaces. Pompeii made the ancient world feel inhabitable, and that feeling, both enchanting and dangerous, has shaped its fame ever since. A calmer understanding of Pompeii comes when we think of it as a city of maintenance, because every living place depends on constant small acts that rarely receive honor. Sweeping floors, repairing plaster, clearing drains, sharpening tools, replacing roof tiles. washing cloth, feeding animals, repainting walls, checking accounts, carrying water, patching shoes, tending lamps, cleaning latrines, pruning vines, storing grain, and keeping doors secure. These tasks created continuity, and without them the city would have failed long before Vesuvius erupted. Archaeology often finds the results of maintenance more than the acts themselves. A patched wall, a worn threshold, a repaired vessel, a reused stone, a blocked doorway, a changed room. And through these signs we see that Pompeii was never static. It was being held together day after day by skilled and ordinary labor. Perhaps this is why the unfinished repairs after the earthquake feel so moving. They show maintenance interrupted, care stopped mid-gesture. The city still trying to continue when the mountain ended the work. Even the silence of the unexcavated parts has meaning. Because not all knowledge must be taken at once, the earth still holds rooms, objects, and traces that future methods may read more gently than present tools can. Leaving parts buried is not neglect when it is chosen wisely. It can be preservation, patience, and trust. Pompeii teaches that discovery and restraint must belong together, because the past is not a mind to be emptied, but a fragile conversation to continue. This restraint also gives the sleeping city a future, because each unopened layer may hold details about households, workshops, plants, repairs, and people whose stories would be harmed by careless speed. To wait can be an act of respect, and in a place made famous by sudden destruction, patience becomes one of the gentlest forms of care and memory. Finally, Pompeii's greatest gift may be the way it brings together the enormous and the ordinary, a volcano, an empire, a city, a household, a loaf of bread, a wall joke, a garden route, a candidate's painted name, a fountain worn by hands, a victim's curled posture, a villa fresco, a shop counter, a bath bench, an unfinished repair. Each scale explains the others. The eruption matters because it ended ordinary lives. The ordinary objects matter because the eruption preserved them. The city matters because it shows the empire at human scale. And the empire matters because it shaped the city's ambitions and inequalities. This layered meaning is why Pompeii remains so powerful after centuries of excavation. It is not only beautiful, not only tragic, not only informative, not only famous, it is all of these at once, and as one wanders it in thought, the mind learns to move gently between wonder and sorrow, between curiosity and restraint, between the desire to know and the humility to admit what cannot be known. As the documentary grows quieter, imagine one ordinary night in Pompeii before the mountain's final day. Not the night of panic, but a night among many peaceful nights. The shops are closed, the stones still hold heat, lamps glow behind shutters, a dog shifts near a doorway. Someone finishes a cup of watered wine, someone counts the day's earnings. Someone scolds a child softly, someone rinses a bowl, someone whispers a prayer to the household gods. Someone reclines in a painted room where mythic figures watch from the walls. Someone sleeps above a shop. Someone wakes briefly to the sound of late footsteps. Someone in a villa beyond the city smells damp earth from the garden. The forum lies open to moonlight. The amphitheater is empty, the baths are dark. The fountains continue their small music, and Vesuvius is only a shape against the stars. No one in that moment belongs to tragedy. They belong to themselves, to family, work, fatigue, desire, memory, and tomorrow. That is the Pompeii worth holding gently before sleep. Because the city was not created by its ending, it was a world before it was a warning. Then imagine the long silence after the eruption, the city covered, the survivors gone, the roads altered, the roofs broken under hidden weight, the walls sealed away from weather, roots slowly entering upper layers, fields returning above streets, people in later centuries walking over ground that held doors below, not knowing the names beneath their feet, empires changing, languages shifting, religions transforming, medieval lives unfolding above Roman ones, Renaissance curiosities stirring, Bourbon tunnels cutting into darkness. lantern light touching painted walls for the first time in centuries, workers calling out as rooms appeared, visitors gasping at colors, scholars arguing, collectors reaching, archaeologists learning, conservators worrying, and slowly, gradually, Pompeii becoming not only a rediscovered city, but a responsibility shared by the world. This long arc from life to burial to rediscovery is why the story remains inexhaustible, because it contains growth, pride, error, disaster, forgetting, desire, knowledge, and care, all layered like the city itself. The rise of Pompeii was the rise of human confidence in a generous place. The fall of Pompeii was the sudden exposure of forces beneath that generosity, and the rediscovery of Pompeii was the beginning of a new relationship between the living and the ancient dead. We cannot return the city to its people. We cannot restore the voices exactly. We cannot undo the fear of the final hours or the damage done by early excavation. But we can listen better, preserve more carefully, and tell the story without turning it into empty drama. Pompeii endures because it gives history a street-level heart, not only emperors and battles, but rooms, meals, repairs, jokes, baths, elections, gardens, debts, devotion, and sleep. And as we leave it now in the calm dark of imagination, we may picture the old city resting beneath the same mountain, no longer merely lost, no longer merely found, but held between earth and memory, asking each generation to walk softly, look closely, and remember that every ordinary city, every ordinary home, every ordinary evening is made of fragile time,